I have all these different screens open. It can
Yeah, I've got
little
that going on too.
a
So,
little much. Okay, we are live. So, welcome everybody to the book club discussion on the Betrayal Bonds by Patrick Carnes. And that's the book we're going to be discussing tonight. And for those of you that are new, my name is Dana Morningstar, and I have with me Shay, who is going to be discussing this book with us. And if you're interested in the notes from this book, you can find them at my website at thriveafterabuse.com/book club. And then under the notes section, that's where I put all the notes and the list of the books for every month. So, and there's also, by the way, there's links down below in the description area for the book club for the Betrayal Bonds book, and then also for Necessary Endings, which is the book that we'll be reading next month. And there's also a link to Audible. There's you can get a free book from Audible if you sign up for the trial. So there's a link down below for that, but it's audibletrial.com/thrive after abuse if you want to get the free book if you sign up. So, hey, Antonia's here and says, shout out to Dana and Shay from Detroit. Welcome.
yeah.
Tracy is here. Antonia is happy she caught the live chat. Yes, good deal. And I had some people every week. I have some people email me, and they're a little bit confused about the live streams. And so, for those of you that are listening to this later, or you can't figure out the live streams, all you need to do is just go to my YouTube channel or any YouTube channel that's having a live stream, and you'll see on there that it says live. And so all you do is you just click on the image of their channel, and it should take you directly into the live stream. And then there's a section for a chat. So we've got a few other people hopping on. We have Lightworker, welcome, and Shadow Fun Play, who says, Dana, I want to thank you so much. Well, you guys are so very welcome. So Shay and Marcel is here. Shay, tell us, did you get a chance to read The Betrayal Bonds? And if so, what did you think about it?
I did. I actually read that a little while ago and kind of I went through Lucy's notes and your notes to kind of refresh that way. Excuse me, I've had a little bit of cold.
It's okay.
But I thought it was a really good, informative book. Isolating that topic because I think it's a really crucial piece. I'm actually watching somebody I know go through that part of it right now, and it's so eye-opening watching where I was while discussing this book. It's just,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very good book to read. I really do recommend reading it. If y'all haven't, I think it's a good book to read.
Yes, I agree. I enjoyed it. And the Betrayal Bonds is really kind of another word for trauma bonds, if that wasn't clear. And I think probably one of the maybe biggest, I don't know. I have notes of my 7 big takeaways from the book, but one of the takeaways was for sure the realization that healthy, there's 2 types of bonds. There's 2 ways that we bond to people in our life. And it really basically falls into healthy bonds and traumatic bonds. There's not a lot of middle ground there. And so I really enjoyed that perspective because in a lot of every other thing I've ever read about trauma bonds really talks about like massive trauma that bonds somebody, like Stockholm syndrome or a severely abusive relationship or these kinds of things. And I had thought for a long time, I was like, I really do feel that it does fall into these kind of 2 groups. Like it's either a healthy bond or it's a toxic bond. And I found it very validating that he said the same thing. He's like, yeah, this is kind of what this is. And to understand that, it's these trauma bonds can really just drag a person through hell. Like they're so deep and they're so intense and they're so painful. And yet, so interestingly enough, we so often confuse them for love. And
And the other thing is, it doesn't have to be a great big deal in order to be a problem. I mean, you can
yes,
have, when you look at intermittent reinforcement, which for anybody who's not familiar with that, that's the idea. If you picture someone sitting in front of a slot machine, pulling the lever, you get a little win. You keep pulling the lever, and it's that nothing, 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 something, nothing, 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 something, bad, something, that really messes with people. And the thing about the whole trauma bond, betrayal bond thing is, it can be a very minor version of that and still have a very negative impact on you. And we aren't taught the difference between what that feels like and what actual love and care is. So we think that we're experiencing love and care when it really has absolutely not one thing to do with that.
yes. And I think the reason it's so confusing is because there's a lot of the same chemicals at play. And so it feels there is that level of intensity and that longing and that craving. And it feels like I can't live without this person. And I think because these conversations, people just don't have these conversations. I mean, how many of us actually learned how to date? Like this, a lot of
Yeah.
the stuff's not taught. You have to kind of trial by fire. And so when people feel that way, that obsessive kind of neediness, it feels like love, but it's not. A lot, like you were saying, Shay, a lot of it's this reinforcement, this negative reinforcement or intermittent reinforcement, where you sometimes get your needs met and then you sometimes don't. And for those who aren't familiar with the term, I'll elaborate even just a little bit more on it. It comes from this concept with when they were looking at rats, and the rat was trained to go push a lever and then a pellet of food would come down. And so the rat learned, you push the lever, you get the food. And then they decided, let's see what happens when sometimes the food drops and then sometimes it doesn't. And so then the rat became very anxious and would begin pushing the lever, and sometimes the food would drop down and sometimes it wouldn't. And so the rat was trying to navigate this environment that was completely unpredictable. And um it's just like you were saying, Shay, with slot machines, it's very much the same way. Like sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but you're not really sure, especially with a slot machine, what you're doing that makes the difference. And
Well,
so,
even once you know about all this, the feelings can be so intense that you still question that,
yeah.
because it can be that intense.
Yes. And I think this is one of those trauma bonds, that intensity between them is one of the reasons a lot of people stay for as long as they do. And when they do leave, every other relationship tends to feel flat.
Yeah.
And they think, okay, what's wrong with me? Am I destroyed? Am I just ruined? Like, did this relationship just ruin me? I'll never be able to love. I'll never find somebody who loves me. And especially if they keep finding themselves with, abusive people, and they're like, where am I going wrong? But a lot of it is they're confusing this intensity with something healthy, and it's not. And so, love bombing isn't healthy. But if we've been if we've got this empty bucket where we've been walking around feeling very unloved or unimportant for a long time, and somebody just swoops in and they make us feel so loved and so important, we just drink that up. But then that's how a person gets sucked into that cycle of abuse more often than
Hmm.
not. And it starts that whirlwind romance, which turns into a tornado. And then when it ends, then the person's thinking, okay, well, this person was abusive. They're the problem, not realizing that there's stuff going on with them chemically and in their brain that they're perceiving. They've got all these unexplored vulnerabilities that are being exploited by abusive people, and they continue to find themselves in these same dynamics over and over again, and they can't figure out why. So this book really, it's, I think, possibly the only book I've read so far that speaks directly and specifically about trauma bonds.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
And one of the
one of the,
biggest
yeah,
things that I got overall from this book was that and before I say this, I want to be real clear. This is not blame, because in no way is this my fault, your fault. This is not, we didn't cause it. But
Yeah.
what a narcissist, for, I don't really like that word anymore, but the problematic person, I like the way you say it better, but they're more of a reflection of how we are treating ourselves. And
Yes.
when I started to look at it that way and got into the whole learning how to do self-love, because that's really the road to feeling the difference between a trauma bond and what care is. Because when you start feeling the care you give yourself, you can look and say, oh, well, this doesn't feel like that. And you start, it's hard to explain this in words, but you do start to really notice that difference. And I've noticed more and more how much, looking back on my experiences, those were more reflections of, that's how I was treating me. We had that in common. We both agreed to treat me this way. It's just I didn't know it. So
Yes. And like you were saying, so much of this, the healing from all of this, is learning to turn inward. And that was something that really tripped me up for a very long time. And something I talked a little bit about last night, where I, I just I didn't connect the dots, and I really, really wanted to. And I kept, you know, reading self-help books, and I was in therapy, and I'm like, what pieces am I missing? Because I just am not.
well, totally, it's like driving with a big blind spot, and you're trying to change
Yeah.
lanes, and you're like, what?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
totally.
and, the whole concept of like, well, you just need to learn how to love yourself. I'm like, that just felt so nebulous. And I'm like, well, I feel like I do like love myself. I mean, I don't hate
Mhm.
myself. I feel like I love myself as much as anybody else loves themselves.
And that was probably true.
Well, right.
Because the,
Yeah.
that's the trouble, is
That's the
nobody's
trouble.
doing practical, teaching us from when we're small, this is how you actually love yourself.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's the missing piece here.
Totally, totally. It's one of those phrases that I think we people are throw around, but none of us know what it really means to actually practice it. And so much of self-love means honoring your intuition and knowing what it means to keep yourself safe, and doing so without feeling shame or guilt or hesitation.
Mhm.
And that's a big, big piece of self-love, is just loving
For
yourself
people
enough to
who
keep
are
yourself safe.
struggling with this idea the way I certainly did for a long time,
Mhm.
one of the good ways to sort of put a foot on this path is, all the things you think you're doing for other people out of love and care, start doing those things for you. That's a good starting point to figure this out, and you start to feel, it'll become more and more clear to you if you do those things for yourself. It's amazingly eye-opening once you start doing that. Just
Yes. Yes. And that helped me too, to get some emotional distance, is if you think about it of, well, what advice, if this was like my daughter coming to me or a good friend, what advice would I give to them? And what advice am I actually, like, what am I actually doing for me? And why is there this divide between the two? Because if I
mhm,
really loved somebody, like if they were my child, or if they were a good friend, and I'm encouraging them to end things or what have you, but I'm not giving myself the same advice, why don't I love myself enough to do what I'm encouraging them to do? So
exactly.
yeah, very interesting stuff. Alcuda Babe says, when anyone says anything bad about a narcissist when you are with them and you're so over the moon with him, then other people become the problem. Yes. And so this is one of the things. So I think human beings at kind of a core level, like once we're getting a need met, we're going to be defensive. Like we're biologically just driven to get our needs met. And if that need is being threatened in some way, we get really defensive because we don't
Mhm.
want it to end. And so even though we know we're in a problematic situation, if somebody else starts mentioning it, then it's very common for the person to become incredibly defensive, and then they start withdrawing and isolating themselves, and they quit spending time with that person because this person is is continually bringing them to this painful reality that they don't want to accept.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. You hear a lot about how there's an isolation tactic that problematic people will use to isolate you.
Yeah.
That sounds like it's typically something they're doing to cause you directly to be isolated, but that's not always the way it happens. A lot of times, and it can be the level of time they're asking of you and all that love bombing stuff where you're spending all this time with them. That's one part of it. But the other part is exactly what you just said. When you get into that defensive place and you start isolating yourself, it's still caused by this relationship dynamic. And
Yes.
that's part of what this isolation everybody talks about is, but there's not a lot said about it in that context. And I think it's important.
Right. All of these things, the red flags and everything, have kind of these two sides to them. So, like with the isolation, on the target side, that love bombing, the narcissist is doing this love bombing because they're like, I really want you to make your whole world about me. And on the target side of it, we're like, man, it feels so good to feel so important. I will happily make my whole world about you. Like, I
Yes.
don't want to spend time with anybody else. I just want to spend time with you. And so then we are like, you know what? My family, my friends, my hobbies, everything goes to the back of the line. I'm just going to make this person my whole world. And so then we willingly get caught up in this whirlwind romance kind of a thing. And then,
Nobody understands how good it is sometimes.
oh, yeah, yeah. And then friends and family get burned out
Mhm.
because they realize like this is a problem, but we don't want to hear it. And so then they get frustrated, and then they kind of isolate themselves because they're like, well, then you know what? Fine. Like you just do your thing, and we're not even going to mention it anymore, because every time we do, you start getting really angry at us, or you push us away, or
Mhm.
they get resentful. They're like, you know what? You only call us when you have some sort of relationship problem or when you're in crisis.
Yeah.
And like, we really, especially friends, your friends are like, what about me? Like, what about if I want to go hang out and I have problems? Like, you're not emotionally available to be a friend to me. You just need a friend when you're in crisis, when your relationship's falling apart.
Yeah, you were talking about that last night, and I
Yeah.
thought that was all very, very spot on, and I related to it.
Big aha moment of kind of some
Hmm.
stuff that we need to work on. And so yeah, that isolation and these, so when you can kind of get some emotional distance and you start seeing how these pieces fit together. I get goosebumps even just talking about
Yeah,
it. Like,
me too.
like you see
It's,
how the pieces fit together, and you just kind of watch with like, as terror kind of overwhelms you, like, oh wow, I get it. Like, I'm seeing how this is all kind of clicking into place.
yeah.
So, let's see. Okay, so one of the first things he says in the book is abandonment by betrayal is worse than mindless neglect. Betrayal is purposeful and self-serving. If it is severe enough, it is traumatic. What moves betrayal into the realm of trauma is fear and terror. And if the wound is deep enough and the terror big enough, your bodily systems shift to an alarm state. You are always on full alert, just waiting for the hurt to begin again. Like anyone who has had a loss, you have shock, disbelief, fear, loneliness, and sadness. You are unaware of these feelings because your guard is up. And in your readiness, you abandon yourself. Yes, another abandonment. You may develop a mind numbing, highly addictive attachment to the people who have hurt you, trying to explain to them that what they did is wrong and trying to convert them into non abusers. You brace yourself against further hurt, which is just a guarantee of more pain. These attachments are called betrayal bonds or trauma bonds. When the hostage defends the captor, when the abused child covers for the parent, when the exploited employee covers for the boss. Bonds between people can be either good or bad. Betrayal bonds include misplaced loyalty, inability to detach, and self destructive denial.
Spot on.
Yep, that's powerful stuff. And then he goes into describing kind of what you were saying, Shay, about trauma. And I think, again, so many of us think, well, trauma, if we can still hang in there, then it must not be traumatic. Or if it doesn't match our idea of what we think trauma is.
Or we think trauma is a thing that happened instead of a thing that didn't happen. And sometimes the bigger
Yeah,
traumas are what didn't happen, and that's pretty huge.
that is huge.
As a
That
lot
is
of us
huge.
think we weren't really exposed to particular traumas. And I think a lot of trauma comes from the kind of neglect, ignoring, just not giving that recognition that, going into childhood, because a lot of this does start in childhood, even with pretty healthy families in the
Mhm.
context of what we have today, because people do the best they can. So I'm not knocking anybody's family or my family when I say
Yeah.
this, but there's just a lot of unconscious parenting because nobody's teaching this stuff. They don't, I didn't know either when I became a parent. I wish I had. I would have done a lot of things differently.
Well, and I think it's a good conversation to have with kids because we never know what messages they're picking up from something. And to just let them know, like, here, basically, here's the deal. Like, life is full of pain and loss, and that's part of it. Goes hand in hand with growth. I mean, there's a good chance you're going to get fired from a job, or something's not going to be fair, or somebody else is going to get promoted, or you might have your a heartbreak in junior high or high school, or even later on in life. And that these events happen because really nobody talks about this stuff. And
No.
so then we're not prepared on with how to handle it, and we think it's us, and then all of this shame starts building when these things
And
do happen, and
not
we
only
think,
that, but imagine how wonderful it would be if you got all of that in early childhood, if it was like a thing that everybody did. And they also gave you the message that there's tremendous beauty in the growth that happens when you go through these negative things, so that it's
yes.
not really the negative it looks like. Imagine how empowering that would be to go through your whole life that way, knowing this. That would be amazing.
Oh, completely. Yes, like teaching kids, like kind of this resiliency of,
Hmm.
you know, yes, like just like you were saying, Shay, life is it's so there's so many emotions and so many events that take place in it. And, everybody, pretty much everybody too, is going to have issues in their childhood, whether it's bullying at school, whether it's bullying at home. And letting a child know, kind of these different coping skills, and if you're coming from a good place as a parent, like, I love you so much, but there still might be things that I do that you might perceive in a certain way that, can a conversation that a child overhears that they weren't meant to overhear. Um, you know, they get grounded for something and they take it intensely personal. Like, it's just so interesting how sometimes it just doesn't take a lot for that trauma to occur in a person's life. Sort of like, what was the gal? She wrote Romancing the Stone. And she was told in college by a writing professor that she had no talent as a writer and that she should just stop. And so she did. She stopped writing and didn't write for like 20 years and then finally published her book. But instead of thinking to herself, wow, that guy's a real jerk, he really must feel powerful, like grinding students down, instead of realizing it was about him, she took him everything he said at face value and quit writing. And so, yeah, kind of like reframing the stuff with kids of, squeeze out what you can from these events, but always try to make it for your highest and greatest good. And other people, when they say hurtful, mean, or insensitive things, it's a reflection of them. It's not a reflection of you.
Yeah, and also the message that everybody's figuring this out, and it's perfect. You're perfectly okay to be on your way figuring it out. There's nothing wrong with that, and you're okay, because
Yes.
all everyone who's listening to us, you're okay.
Right. Right. And, just invalidating kids too, of like, nobody starts at the finish line. And, I remember my first year as a nurse, I was so incredibly stressed out and I cried so much. And it was so anxiety inducing because I was so concerned. I just didn't want to hurt anybody. And I wasn't 100% confident in what I was doing. And, it was the pressure was so intense. And I thought it was, then I felt even worse because I'm like, oh no, it's just me. Everybody else must feel so confident and capable. And, because nobody talks about stuff like that. And then realizing, oh no, really everybody feels that way.
Yeah,
And if they,
everybody's busy trying to seem like they,
yeah,
put that confident face forward, but yet we're all sitting here feeling like I don't know what I'm doing, and we think we're alone, but we're not.
yes, exactly. And so, okay, so back to the trauma bond thing. It's so important, I think, to talk to kids and realize, okay, there's two different types of bonds. This is how this happens. A lot of the same chemicals are involved, and um, it can feel similar, but it's important that we look deeper at the foundation of what's bonding us to this person. If somebody's feeling, if somebody's treating us without dignity, without respect, if they're being, they're using, abusing, exploiting, or neglecting us, like this isn't love. And so while it might feel like love, it's not. And for us to be able to separate those differences, and I think also to realize that just because we feel intensely towards a person isn't a valid reason to stay. There's lots of things that we do in life because that we may not feel like doing. And because a lot of people, and myself included, will feel like, well, but I love him. And it's like, well, that might be true, but you still need to move yourself to safety, even though you have these intense feelings.
If something's just making you feel really bad and confused, nobody needs to be in that place. Doesn't matter how much you
Yeah.
love the other person, you are a being worthy of love, period. And
Yes.
you do not need to feel that way. And
Right. And
I, that's so important to understand. And I really didn't.
oh yeah, me neither. I really felt like my love for other people trumped all. And as long as I kind of had enough love for both of us, like then it was somehow going to work out because commitment was forever. And I just really thought everything could be solved. And so, now realizing I might love another person, I might feel intensely towards another person, but it can never come at the expense of loving myself.
No, and it shouldn't.
And it
And
shouldn't, right? Yeah.
no, it shouldn't. And when you get in, you can make a whole study of what compassion really is, and enabling somebody else to treat you like shit isn't being loving to them either. But that was not a concept I was capable of grasping until a lot more recently.
Mhm.
So
Yes. Yes, I agree. Okay, so he talks about trauma, how trauma affects people in 8 major ways. The first one is trauma reaction. And this is where a person struggles with a series of PTSD reactions. Perhaps they are triggered by similar events, or they avoid, or they self-sabotage in order to avoid being hurt again. So they're kind of living out these reactions to trauma, and this goes on until that PTSD stuff can be kind of resolved. There's the trauma arousal, where stimulation and pleasure compensate for pain and emptiness. And this might be, well, I guess both kind of the narcissist and their target. Oftentimes, sex is a big one, drug use, alcohol, those kinds of things where they need that intense stimulation in order to feel something because they're just so numbed out. Number 3 is trauma blocking. And this is where a person tries to do anything to escape the uncomfortable feeling, usually some form of numbing, comforting, relaxing, anesthetizing. This could be done with drugs, alcohol, TV, sex, food, spending, or sleeping. There's trauma splitting. This is where a person disassociates from the experience and creating another reality or fantasy. There is the real person, and then there is the Mr. Hyde, the alcoholic or the abuser who destroys everything that the Dr. Jekyll cares for. They find themselves daydreaming, being preoccupied with something else that needs to be attended to, living in a fantasy world when things get tough, or losing themselves in fantasies or in drugs and alcohol. We get lost in the fantasy world and we want to stay there. And in the book, he gives the example of in Star Trek, there's the holodeck. and how the characters in Star Trek, they'll go, especially if you're a Star Trek fan, like the Next Generation was the series where they would normally go to the holodeck, and that's how they would relieve stress or boredom. And he says, it's okay to visit the holodeck, like in our real life. It's okay to visit that fantasy land, but it's a problem if we want to live there. And so the next one is trauma abstinence. This is where we feel the need to be in control and to go without. We deprive ourselves, we settle for crumbs, we have feelings of unworthiness. This is where a person denies themselves the basic needs like groceries, shoes, books, medical care, rent or heat, sex. They might hoard money, or they might avoid spending it on legitimate needs. They perform at underachieving jobs, make extreme or unwarranted sacrifices for work. They spoil success opportunities. They have periods of no interest in eating or attempts to diet repeatedly. They seek comfort, luxury. Oh, they see comfort, luxury, and play as frivolous. They skip vacations because of a dedication to an unrewarding task. They have difficulty having fun. They are underemployed, and they may have eating disorders. This is very common in families that have neglected children. Neglectful families teach lessons about self-care and self-esteem. This is exactly what you were saying, Shay. The antidote to being out of control is to be in control. So wherever there is addiction or extremes, there's always deprivation. Deprivation can become its own addiction and its own solution to trauma. That was very interesting. I see this a lot in the support groups, and kind of in my own life too, where if you've been taught to settle for crumbs, then crumbs are all that you're comfortable with. And it can take a lot of work for a person to build up that self-esteem if feeling like, yeah, well, why not me?
Well, when you get into that place where you feel like the only way you can get love is to sacrifice these other things, and you want the love more than you want those other things, you'll give up anything to have the love, because the feeling of love, and that's kind of the be all end all for and why we do anything else, really. So of course it's pretty natural to deprive yourself of anything in order to have that one thing that you want more. But all
Yeah.
that time you don't know that it's not really the thing you want. It's not really love that you're giving up all this for. And that's a tremendous that's a rabbit hole to go down when you realize all the crumbs you took and what little it was for. In retrospect, it's a pretty big deal.
It is. And it can be absolutely heartbreaking when, Katrina here in the chat is saying, she's like, I can't even cope with what she just read. I'm from a neglected family, and oh my God, that's so sad. Yes, deprivation. And when the lights do start coming on and people, they are connecting the dots, there is this, I mean, I get goosebumps thinking about it. Like, it's so intense when you make that connection, because so much just starts making sense. I call moments like these like minesweeper moments. If you're familiar with that game where you're clicking around and then you click on one spot and then it just kind of opens up that whole area.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. If any, I don't know if anybody under like the age of 25 is familiar with that game, but that was big for us. And yes, it just so much makes sense. But when we make those connections, there is the kind of this whole grieving process that we have to go through too, of
That's what I
realizing.
was about to say, is when you start going there and you first really start realizing this, the grief can hit you out of nowhere and just knock your socks off. And that's part of it, but you don't stay there. But
Yes.
it can really surprise the hell out of you just how hard that grief will slam you when you get to that place. But there's a lot of goodness on the other side of that. So just if that's where you are, or you haven't been there yet and you find yourself there, it's
Yeah.
worth it, and it's okay. It's part of it. There's nothing wrong with you. It's just let yourself grieve it. And that's important.
It is important. And it is, and it truly is like the different stages of grief, kind of the whole denial, bargaining, anger, acceptance. Um, I forget all of them, but there's 7 different stages. And a person, you're not going to go through all of the stages in a certain order. And odds are you're going to go through stages and you're going to keep going round and round in those stages until there's kind of this resolution reached internally. And so it's very normal for a person when they start seeing this, or like they get really angry at their family, or they get really angry at kind of what they feel to be like time lost. Like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe I've worked at this job for 30 years and I've worked so below my potential. And now I see why. And it's just a lot. There's just a lot of feelings that can kind of go along with this, or why we've been attracted to certain people and certain friendships and everything. So it's the growth that can come from narcissistic abuse is so extremely intense, but it's so life-changingly powerful.
I
And
know this sounds like a really, there was a time when I would have totally blocked out anybody who even said this. But as shitty and painful and horrible as it is to go through a lot of it, you get to a certain point where you look back and you at least me, I can't even feel that bad about it now because of how much of a gift, how
yes,
many gifts I've gotten from cleaning up all the things in myself that it's caused me to clean up. And I'm going to be doing that for, I mean, I'm not done by any means. I'm still, but you get to this point where it starts to be kind of fun and interesting to explore all this stuff because enough of the grieving has gone through and you're not dissociating anymore and you're feeling your feelings and you feel capable and confident in yourself and you get the love piece, the self-love piece. When you
Mhm.
start down that channel, it becomes really pretty exciting and awesome. And I really feel like I can almost promise anybody, if you really commit to yourself and stick with it and just give yourself compassion and talk yourself through these things and come to other people when you need help to do that, because any of us would help someone else in this position. uh, it's so worth it. I mean, I just can't put into words how incredible the other side actually is. And I think most people, normal, neurotypical people, don't get to experience what you get to experience when you have gone through this. So, in a way, it's kind of, I kind of want to say it gives you sort of superpowers because
I would
it
agree.
does.
It does. It really does. I mean, that I almost feel bad for people that kind of live this normal life because there's not this tremendous growth curve there. And there's not the possibility of a tremendous growth curve.
No. If
I mean,
you're
there's
only kind of sort of a little bit miserable to the point where you really don't know that you are, there's no catalyst to push you off of that. So,
exactly.
in a way, when your whole life blows up, it can be the best thing that ever happened to you when you look back on it.
Yep. Yep. I mean, it was for me. I really, you know, I didn't think so at the time. It was
Oh,
absolutely,
no.
I mean, like,
No.
it took me a while to get to that point, but like,
Oh,
it
yeah.
was, absolutely devastating. But then I kind of realized, actually, no, it was a friend of mine who had said, the best thing about having your life blown apart is that you get to choose brick by brick what you want to rebuild with.
And that includes your beliefs, your values. I mean, it's everything. It's not just
Everything.
physical things where you want to live, what you want to do for a living, who your friends are. That's part of it. But the bigger picture is just who you are and what you want to exemplify in your life. And what, I mean, that's so powerful. It's just,
It
it
really
really
is.
is.
And, light worker is saying, I don't want to stay on the being abused side. No way. Right. And that's kind of the benefit too of contrast, because once you know what you don't want, then by default what you do want. And so you don't need to have all of the answers right now. You just need to start moving in the direction of what you do want. Move in the direction of what's nourishing and nurturing empowering and healthy for you. And that's the key phrase is for you. So once you start figuring out, okay, who am I? What is nourishing and nurturing to me? Maybe, it's like for me, after my whole, right, it was like the tail end of my situation with Jack. I sat down and I began. It's so funny how like our higher self keeps trying to come through to us, and hindsight being what it is, like you see it for what it is. But I was making a list out of all of the things, like what did I really want in my life? Because I really, even though I loved the life that I had, I didn't like the city that I was living in. Like, these are not my people. This is just not my place. And I felt that in my bones. And so I was making this list of what I wanted. And so I was like, okay, for me, it's about water. I like being around lakes. I like being around kind of a mom and pop, kind of local type environment. I like not having to, I don't like a lot of traffic. I like a place where I can have a bonfire. Can't do that in New Mexico so much. So just kind of getting clear on like what are certain elements that you really enjoy in your life. And then because for every person, it's going to be so unique. And so once you kind of really start tuning in to what's pulling you,
And if you're in a
move in
place
that
like
direction.
where I was, where I don't freaking know. I don't know what I mean, yeah, I like chocolate ice cream, but other than that, I didn't know. The way I got here from there was to just start at that small place. It's like, okay, I like chocolate ice cream. Start with the small preferences and start really thinking about, well, how do I feel about chocolate ice cream? It sounds silly, but if you start doing that in small ways, very consistently, this other stuff starts to click into place. Is I know
Yes.
when you're at that beginning, it's like, self-love, preferences. I don't know what I need. I don't know what I want. It's and there's not a lot of
Yes.
practical how to, A, B, C, and D are the steps you can take to feel self-love and to know what you need. Because that's the piece everybody's missing, and that's why I'm butting in to say this is I think that's the easiest starting point if you're clueless about, I don't know what nourishes me. I don't even know what nourishment feels like. Because I was there. I had no clue. And one of the things that helped me too was your rating scale, the 1 to 10, to just look at objects and things in your life and just give them a rating. That's very helpful with learning what your preferences are, and that's the gateway into the rest of it for anybody who's like, I don't know what the hell.
Yeah.
So
And so many of us, Carolina's saying here in the chat, she says, I used to feel guilty for identifying I needed more than crumbs. Then
of
I was,
course.
right? Then I was accused of being a narcissist. It's crazy making. I don't feel bad anymore. 1 year later, I know that I'm worthy. And I'm so glad to hear that. But yes, that's exactly what it is. It's if we speak up and say, this is my preference, this is what I want, then it's sort of like, oh, well, you're ungrateful, or, there's other people with less and you should be happy for what you have, and nobody's perfect. And kind of all of these techniques, these kind of shaming techniques to get a person back in that box. And
Mm.
so many of us, if you've grown up with being taught that you somehow deserve to settle for crumbs, probably don't have a preference. If people ask you, you're probably so used to disappointment that it's easier to just not have a preference than it is to be disappointed.
Or
So,
to have adopted the preferences that were sort of handed to you and
yes.
believe that they're yours. One of the other things I did was just throw everything away. Like I thought that I didn't like this food. How do I know that? Have I ever approached this food with a totally open, I've never tasted it before and I don't know what I think about it beginning standpoint? I started doing that with everything to see what it was I actually liked. And that's very helpful. For me, it was.
That's huge. And I think too, another way that can go down is if a person has, if they have a narcissist in their life, then let's say, for example, the narcissist is like, where would you like to go for dinner? And the target no longer has preferences because all their preferences are wrong. So now, but they think they might have preferences. So now they're kind of choosing from the options that of what they know the narcissist would like.
Yes.
So they're like, well, yeah, let's go down to, I don't know, the Chinese place down the block, because they know that that's on the short list of places that the narcissist really likes to go. So it's sort of like they think that they have options, but they really don't. It's sort of like asking a kid, which vegetable would you like, peas or carrots? And the kid thinks that they have a choice, but they really don't. And so it's a big thing, kind of getting in tune with yourself of like, what do you want? What do you really want? And like, even if you don't feel safe telling other people that, Christmas is coming up and you're like, man, I'm so used to I get hurt feelings every single year because whatever, I don't even ask for stuff anymore because I know it's either I'm not going to get it, or it's going to be like a month late, or it's going to be something. So it's just safer to just make it seem like it's no big deal
Well,
to
and we
protect.
don't want to we don't want to deal with the disappointment factor again and
Yeah.
again, because that hurts. That's pain. So it's just easier. Well, if I don't want anything, I don't have to be disappointed.
Yeah. But it's really wild when you get to the place where you realize I really don't know
Yeah.
what I want. And then to see all the different ways that that's kind of spilled over of the choices we've made with a career, or with the clothes we wear, the car we drive, or kind of some of the friends we might have, or the hobbies we have, or where we live, or in so many different ways, we've kind of lived this life of default, and how powerful that is. Diana is saying here in the chat, yeah, if I make a choice, he shoots it down. And, one of the things that, um, my mom used to say, because this was growing up, that was the ongoing conversation. If my dad were to say, hey, where do you guys want to go out to eat? And then my mom would offer suggestions, he would just continually say like, no, no, no. And finally she got to the point where she says, you know what? I'm not playing this game anymore. You decide. I'm not a mind reader. You decide.
Isn't it funny how people can get their way that way?
Yeah. And then they make it seem like, well, but just keep picking until you guess what I'm thinking.
I mean, somebody can manipulate you by simply sucking a sour lemon faces every time you make a suggestion. That's a big deal.
Yes.
And it really blew my mind to realize small things like that. You get into this headspace where you feel like, oh, well, I'm just being bitchy and demanding. And, it's this whole mental trip you can send yourself down. But those little things actually do matter. And the way you feel about them
Yes.
totally matters. That matters.
It does. And, to other people, it might seem petty, but it's not petty when you're continually living like that, where kind of everything that you do or say is wrong, or is, second guessed or kind of micromanaged like that. It really does grind a person down. And, and you might find too, just kind of FYI, listening to these kinds of conversations, or kind of watching my red flag video series, you're like, man, I do some of these things too.
Mm-hmm.
So all of this growth process, and if we're catching some of our, like, man, I do that. Like I'll ask, if you're like, man, I ask my friends, hey, where do you guys want to go for dinner? And then I play the guess what I'm thinking game and don't even realize it. So like you might catch it in yourself and you're like, okay, I didn't even realize I was doing that. But yeah, I could see how annoying that would be. I'm not doing that anymore.
Yeah, but when that happens, don't try not to go down the path of, oh, I must be an awful person. Maybe I'm a narcissist.
Yes,
Maybe I'm,
right.
because the fact of the matter is, if you're even exploring this, if you've sat here and watched this much of this video, you are interested in self-exploration, or you would not be sitting here listening to either one of us or reading all the things you're reading, you are totally okay on a journey learning who and how you want to be. And there's not one thing wrong with that. And it's okay. I mean, you just look at it as, okay, this is what I was doing. The awareness piece, when you become aware of whatever you were doing that you don't like, and you go, oh, that's not how I want to be, you get the opportunity to start changing things gradually. And that's okay. You don't have to be the completed work to be totally worthy of love and comfort and care. And you don't have to earn that. You do not have to earn that.
Yes. I think it really just starts with the realization of it's okay to keep yourself safe.
Mhm.
and sane. And if, I was talking last night, some of the big criteria for me in my life right now is I no longer have friendships or relationships that are perpetually confusing, crazy making, controlling or critical. Any of those four things are just instant deal breakers. It's too much of an energy drain on me. And just realize, I think it helps to just kind of set some parameters for like what you're not going to tolerate. I will no longer tolerate being treated with disdain, hostility, or contempt. Like friends don't treat other friends like that. Your partner should not be treating you like that. Like that's outrageous. It's how you treat an enemy, not a friend, not a partner.
And the tricky piece with that is you have to get to the place where you realize that you count enough to
Yes.
be worth making that distinction. And whenever you have trouble, if you wrestle with that, every single person is born worthy of that. You don't have you That's why I keep repeating, you don't have to earn it. There is
Yes.
nothing you need to do to be worthy of having a preference and being cared for and caring for yourself. That's, if you have to write that down 100 times, if you have to put it on sticky notes all over the place, whatever it takes. I mean, it's because without feeling like and it's not entitlement to say, I deserve to treat myself well. I deserve to not be in toxic situations. That's not entitlement. That's not selfish. That's just self care. And nobody's really taught self care. So I'm really big on drumming that in to myself and anyone who will bother to listen to me. You need to care about you.
Yes. And these are just basic fundamental human rights. These are the rights that we give prisoners. That's how basic and fundamental they are. Like these are basic human rights that you are to be treated with dignity and respect. And this was kind of one of the big issues with the whole Guantanamo Bay issue when they had the guards, humiliating prisoners. And people were outraged because it's like, what, they might be prisoners, but that's not okay. And we're not wartime prisoners. So we also are entitled. It's a basic human right to be treated with dignity and respect. It's like Shay is saying,
Yeah.
it's not something that you have to earn. It's just you're a living creature and deserve to be treated with dignity and respect.
And it is mind blowing to realize just how many of us have so much in common with a prisoner of war.
Yes.
Seriously. I mean, it's when you really look at that and what the experiences are and what the tactics are exactly the same. That's pretty mind-boggling. There is no outrage about it because no one's really looking at it that way, but it really can do the same exact thing to you. And just to bring it back to the idea of the trauma bonds, because that's where this connects,
Hmm.
is the prisoner of war goes through this same kind of trauma bond because this person become whoever the prison master or guard is has real and or perceived power over your nourishment, your sleep, your shelter,
Life.
it's
Yeah.
and whether or not that's physically true in our position, and sometimes it becomes physically true. There was a point for me where I was so sick from it all that it became physically true, where I could not have escaped if I wanted to. And I've seen that happen to a lot of people. And this is a side of what trauma bonding can do to you that I just don't see discussed anywhere. It can literally physically kill you. I mean,
Yeah.
to just realize how huge the trauma bond piece is in this, because it's a survival. Trauma bonding is a survival skill, because in that situation you find yourself in, your survival feels contingent on this person. And it doesn't really matter whether that's because your perception of it is skewed or because it's actually physically true. Biologically, the chemicals in your body, it's the same thing. It doesn't have to be physically true. Just because you could look at it and say, oh well, I could walk out whenever I wanted to. If you're struggling with that piece, then you can't, or you would have done it. And the reason I point that out is because knowing that there's this huge trauma bond chemical thing going on in your body takes some of that pressure off judging yourself for being somehow less than because you can't even get away from this person, can't stop thinking about this person, all that stuff. It's totally normal, and it's biological. It's not because you are broken.
Right.
It's biological, and that stuff gets out of your body when you create that distance and that safety for yourself. It gets so much better.
Completely. And it really does help to expand, to broaden your horizons and to expand your world. And so, because it is such a primitive driver, human beings, like, it's real, like, if, for example, it's really hard to leave a job that you hate if you don't already have a job lined up. It's really hard to, um, leave a relationship if you don't have a support system in place. If this person's become your whole world where you don't have friends, you don't have a job, you don't have hobbies, it's really it'd be difficult for anybody to walk
And when
away
you
from.
don't have preferences and you're sitting here
Yeah.
thinking, I don't know if I can cut it. I don't know if I can, because you're being ground down. So even more than you already were, you don't even have a preference. How are you going to go out in the world and do this?
Yeah,
It's,
or the self-esteem or the self-worth or any of it. And so it really
yeah.
is this spiral, this downward spiral that you know, it's like that whirlwind romance. It turns into this tornado, and it's just this downward spiral that people find themselves in. And these trauma bonds, yes, they can kill a person. Either they drive a person to, generally, I think it's more of we stay with the wrong people long enough that it either destroys us emotionally, or it drives a person to suicide, or it can lead to them being murdered because they're
Or it can lead to you becoming so sick from the stress. You
yes.
can, it can sneak up on you that way. And then it is harder to get out because you have this compounded problem of not being physically as capable, for lack, I don't like to say it that way because I'm not, and I was there, so this is no judgment. I went through this. I was bedridden for a couple of years, and that's not, it's an awful place to be when you think that no matter what you changed in your emotional being, that you physically can't, you know do for yourself the basic things that you need to do for yourself. But I can tell you, and I've seen not just with myself but other people, getting that toxicity away from you and starting to get in touch with your feelings and to care about yourself, the physical stuff, I'd be willing to bet 99.9% of the time you will get so much better. That going from bedridden to, in the last 2 weeks, I walked 75 miles. So
Wow.
if you are in that place, please know, if you want proof, it can completely change. Right here, I'm sitting here as proof that yes, you can go from bedridden and near death to thriving. I swear it's so totally possible. It's even
Yeah.
probable if you just keep going.
Yeah. I mean, really, the first step is, you know, distance yourself from the poison,
Yes,
you know?
that's
It's
huge.
Narc Free asks a good question. And let's talk about this for a little bit here. She says, okay, is the line that they are incurably dysfunctional, or is the line that they can, like, if they are they where is that line in the sand between being like incurably dysfunctional or self-reflection? And I see a lot of people kind of and I get it. There's no judgment here. They get caught up in this when they're trying to research narcissism, and they're trying to figure out, okay, is this person, you know, is this just persistently problematic, or is this like pathologically problematic? And really, it's potato.
It
So
doesn't matter
it
if
doesn't matter. Like,
it
toxic is
feels like
toxic.
it does when you're in the stage where you're really looking at that, and at
Yes.
least, and I'm talking from this is what it was like for me, so there's no judgment in this because I'm holding my hand up as this was me. I realize now that when I was doing all that, well, are they really totally unhelpable? Could I get through? That was part of still being in the denial phase of wanting some way to cling on to that hope. That's
Yeah.
something that I wouldn't have to face what felt like, and it comes back again to the trauma bond thing, is you have to face that if you can't fix the situation somehow. And the truth is that something that's making you unhappy enough to do that research in the first place, that's already your answer. It doesn't matter if they're a narcissist. It doesn't matter if they could change. If they wanted to change, they would already be doing it, and you wouldn't be researching on Google why, I mean,
Yeah.
that the question is the answer. It does not, you don't have to diagnose somebody, you don't have to label somebody, you don't have to judge somebody. It's enough to know I cannot thrive this way. But the problem is you have to have an I that you're grounded in to be able to say, I'm going to walk away from anything where I can't thrive. And that's the trouble spot, because there is, you've denied your needs, you don't even know that you've denied your preferences, you don't even, you're so used to crumbs even from yourself. And I'm going to backspace and use whiteout and say especially from yourself, because really this is more about how we treat ourselves than it is how anybody in the world treats us. That
Yeah.
sounds harsh, and I don't mean it that way, because when it shows up as a reflection, it hurts, it sucks, it's very painful, and it's not your fault or my fault that that's what's happening. And the power in it is, once you realize, okay, if I'm allowing this, I have the power to change that. So it's not a bad thing. You can redirect all that. It's
Yes.
just but it's, that's the hard part, is finding the I in it all, to stand up for yourself and say, okay, this is a problem. When you're flooded with all these trauma bonding chemicals and you feel like this person is your be all end all, it's really, that's a hard, I don't know even if there's a possible way to give somebody a roadmap to, this is how you do it, because I feel like that's an individual journey. It's like you were talking about this last night about, and I related a lot to it, of having helped people, thinking I was helping people when really I kind of was getting in the way of their own transformative journey and their own right to experience painful things and learn and grow from that. It's not my business to interfere. You kind of
Hmm.
know what I mean by that. And
Yep.
it's, there is no way anybody can hand anyone else the answers. We can share the ahas and hope that that triggers for the other person their own power, because it's your power that gets you out of this. Nobody, and it's amazing to realize that you do have that power. And when you've been doing it, it's a beautiful thing to realize you can. And a lot of self love comes from realizing that in the process, that you develop a deep, abiding respect for yourself. So keep plugging away at this.
Yeah, I agree. And I would encourage people, if they're on the fence and they're trying to kind of figure out, like, okay, well, when do I stay and when do I go, to get really clear with yourself with how much time and energy and potentially money, if you're going to be in therapy, are you willing to throw at this, and for what kind of changes are you needing to see, and in what time frame. Realizing too, if you're dealing with like, an abusive person, like a verbally or emotionally abusive person, you should be seeing some sort of change. They're not going to normally, the game might shift, like they might just start abusing in a different way, but which is still equally as problematic. So it's like you have to kind of get clear of like when you're going to cut bait and drive on. But the challenge though is, if you're dealing with somebody that's kind of more of that sociopathic personality, getting clear on like the changes that you need to see in a time frame, they can really flip a switch and do a great job of seeming as this instantly changed partner and being on their best behavior, and then really they just get
Hmm.
better at living a double life.
Yeah.
So it's really, I'm a big fan of, once somebody shows you their true colors, like, believe them. And these people are so deceptive and so deceitful that you'll know. And for me right there, that alone, like, if there's no trust, then there's nothing. And it's foolish to trust somebody who has a continued pattern of breaking your trust. And
And all the labeling things? Are they a narcissist? Are they aware? Do they know what they're doing? All these questions we've all asked
Yeah.
that seem so huge. And there's a time when they seem very important to understand. And there is a place for that exploration. So I'm not criticizing anyone for needing to go through that. It's in my opinion, it's part of it. It's part of how we learn about what it all even means to have the growth that we will have. So I think it's very important to explore all of that. So I'm not diminishing that at all. But you get to a point where you start to realize that asking yourself again and again, do they know what they're doing, is irrelevant to the fact that it's crushing you. And you have a right not to be crushed. And that's the more important question. You can look back and philosophize about it all you want to later when you're safe, but be safe.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, it really just boils down to if it's, if it's toxic for you, it's toxic, and you don't need to justify or defend or explain or argue or do anything else. Like if it's not working for you, then it's not working, and to get yourself to a place where you're safe and sane. Okay, let me finish this list of these 8 things. So Shay, feel free to hop in here anytime. Okay, so number 6 in this list of how trauma affects people's trauma shame, feeling unworthy and having shame due to the trauma experience. Number 7 is trauma repetition, recreating the same traumatic experiences over and over. It can be repeatedly doing something self destructive, usually something that took place in childhood and started with the trauma, reliving a story from the past, engaging in abusive relationships repeatedly, repeating painful experiences, scenes, or doing something to others that you experienced as an early life trauma. Let me stop there for a second because I think there's some different stuff going on. So from what I have experienced, from what I've seen with other people, um, it's very common, for a person, let's say if a child is abused or molested, it's very common for them to grow up and not even as an adult, but even as like a teenager, to start abusing and molesting younger children. And then as an adult, for them to continue that cycle of abuse and molestation. And so I think that to me is more of that trauma repetition where this happened to them. And it's just interesting how people, to me, it's so foreign. Like if somebody did something so awful to me, I would never want to do that to somebody else because I know how awful it is. So to me, I don't understand that thought process, but it's very common for people to keep that cycle going. When I think people continually engage in abusive relationships repeatedly, I don't think it's this compulsive acting out necessarily. I mean, for some people it might be, but really what I've seen is that uh, there's pieces of information that people are missing. Like they don't understand that they have these unaddressed vulnerabilities. They don't understand that other people are just not like them. I think that's a really big one. And that not everybody can be fixed because they're not like them.
And if you
And
have any kind of childhood trauma, and I'm going to go back for a second to the what was missing piece,
mhm,
you don't have to have been beaten or locked in a closet or starved or anything dramatic. It can be very low key stuff that had good intentions behind it. It really, if you had those kinds of things in childhood, let's say you had a father who was dismissive and you always tried to get his attention, but you never really got it. You can spend your life that's the type of person you'll become friends with and you'll date, is someone who you feel like you'll realize that you're always trying to get them to sort of notice you and approve of you, and not in the way where it's, hey, look at me. Exactly, it's much more subtle than that. It's this unconscious need to have love and recognition from this specific type of person that is a bigger deal than I think a lot of people realize. And I know it was definitely true for me.
yeah. And Maria says on here, I remember constantly saying, why are they doing this to me? And then I said, why am I doing this to myself? And my life changed from there. Yes, it's such a huge mindset shift when we realize that this is nuts. Like, what am I doing? Why am I still here? Why is this person still in my life? Like, this is insanity. I've got to get out of here. And it is very, very eye opening when when we realize, like, I don't have to put up with this. Like, this is just crazy. And because it is, I mean, it does feel like that life is happening to us, like they're taking all these actions to us. And if we don't realize that we can leave, um even if leaving is not easy, if a person has children or they don't have a job or money, leaving is sometimes very difficult. But
Yeah.
um just realizing, okay, there are other options here. Like, I don't have to hang on and continue to get dragged through hell. Like, I can start formulating a plan to leave. And that's really powerful stuff. Okay, so the last point here was the trauma bonds, or the last part of how trauma affects people is the trauma bond, destructive bonds formed by betrayal and hurt. And kind of on that note, so the third big takeaway I had from this book was, and I think you guys will really relate to this, understanding this seduction story. There is always something kind, noble, or likable about somebody who has betrayed you. And oftentimes they suck their targets in with some form of seduction story. The author, he uses the example of how animal trappers trap monkeys. And what they do is they'll have a cage with bars that are just wide enough for the monkey's little hand. And they'll put a piece of fruit in the cage. And so the monkey sticks his hand through and he grabs onto the piece of fruit, but he can't pull it out. And so he's trapped. And even though the animal trappers are walking up to him, and even though they're carrying him in the cage away, that monkey doesn't let go of that piece of fruit because it keeps thinking, I can get that. I'm after the fruit. I want the fruit. I'm going to get the fruit. Even though, now he's, it's taken him to a bad place. And he says, don't fall for the seduction story. Like, let go. That piece of fruit comes with a cage around it. Don't fall for the seduction story. And he says in dating, it's important to look at the types of people and situations in which we were and why we were dating them. And do we find ourselves in a pattern of impossible situations? Like we fall in love with a person that's married, for example, or who we can't be with for whatever reason, problematic situations, or cosmic soulmate type relationships, because all three of these are big red flags that this is something that's problematic.
One
And
thing I'd add to those examples is um, the whole Mr. Unavailable, emotionally unavailable thing. If you find yourself consistently with people who let you down on commitments or can't commit to you and are not dependable, anything in that arena, that's part of this too.
yes, yes. And Missouri Cowboy says, yeah, the monkey cannot let go of the fruit. Something has to hit the monkey's arm so the monkey lets go. That's a very valid point. And generally, that wake up call is intense pain. Somebody says, if you go back, the odds of him killing you are greater than the odds of him changing. And it's that pain moment. Or if somebody, and it might not even be that extreme. It might be somebody like you're at a family reunion and your significant other just explodes into rage and everybody just looks at you like, I, I, I didn't realize that this was going on. Who is this lunatic? And it's that moment of realization of, I can't be in this. It's whatever causes us pain that we let the fruit go. But because we're so starved out, it's really difficult for a person to think clearly when they're starved out. And if we keep, and we're slipping in and out of denial is what it is, that cognitive dissonance that leads to denial, where we keep thinking, yeah, but the fruit, I bet it's so delicious. And if that cage wasn't there, I bet that fruit would be so nourishing and so delicious. And we're lying to ourselves, and we want to go reach back in and grab onto that fruit thinking, well, maybe if I just kind of turned the banana, vertically, then maybe I could get it out. And if I could, and we're trying to rationalize and justify and make this impossible situation work. And the reality is it's like, this is a cage and this is a problem. And so it's important for us to keep that pain fresh. And this is why, I recommend writing down reasons why, like the for when you miss him or her list. Why are you leaving? What are they doing that's causing you pain? And if you need to, posting it on your refrigerator, keeping it, take a picture of it, keep it on your phone, remind yourself of, make a video to yourself of why you're leaving. So, you can experience that pain and it can jolt you awake. So you let go of the illusion. And he also says, trauma survivors can be extremely naive even while being vigilant. Their discernment and common sense have been impaired by living with secrets, denial, deception, and exploitation, leaving them to continually pick all of the wrong people and be continually seduced. Along with seduction comes a sustaining fantasy or supporting script. The victim of seduction usually wants so badly for the story to be true that they will overlook the obvious and accept the improbable. The sustaining fantasy can come in any number of forms. There's the belief in the story, which is usually a tale that explains why we are in the situation we are in, or why we are taking the specific actions, or where we are headed. There's the belief in the person, the abuser who may be wonderful, who may be doing wonderful things for others, is viewed as somebody with high credibility whose behavior is beyond question. The belief in the dream, there's almost always there is the promise of realizing some cherished goal, be it a personal goal, a state of well-being, or the redressing of some loss or wound. Or the belief in the mission, there's often a noble cause or meaningful vision that requires personal sacrifice. And it's so true. When a person's in a problematic situation, they really do want to believe in possibility over probability. They want to hold on to that hope of, if somebody were to say, well, statistics show that, these kind of abuse rehabilitation programs, have a 97% failure rate. To a person that's in an abusive relationship, they would hear that and be like, okay, so you're saying there's hope. And they're
Yeah.
going to hold on to like that 3%, even though their partner has shown no desire to change, no sincere accountability, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no desire or ability to stay in an abuser rehabilitation program ever, or for any length of time, and their behavior doesn't change. So like, all signs point to know that this person's not changing, but then they continue to hold on to hope. But maybe if I just hang in there long enough, things are going to turn a corner and I'm going to have this relationship. Because we talked about this last night, kind of this whole sunk cost, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Fallacy, sunk cost fallacy, where we've put in so much time and energy and money and emotion into making this work. And we don't want to walk away in case, like, we're almost there. We're just a few steps away from the magic happening. But
Yeah.
it's,
I can say each one of these points, I can look back and see where they did apply to me. I definitely do see that from where I am.
oh, totally. And he says too, the seduction story always relies on the victim's willingness to trust them again. The victim must prefer this fantasy over facts, behaviors, and results. And one of the questions he asks, and I love this, I really think, you guys, this is definitely worth your time doing. He asked the question of, write a description of the typical person who can seduce you, and why do you think that is? So looking at the patterns, does it tend to be that love bombing? They want to spend all this time with you. You feel a sense of relief of, oh my goodness, I've found Prince or Princess Charming, or finally I've made this amazing best friend that's come out from out of nowhere, and is, like this kind of whirlwind starts up, and then you start noticing little things that are off. Like they seem really kind of controlling or very possessive, or you're seeing bouts of rage, or things are moving too quickly, or things start to kind of get funny. Like, what is the pattern? What kind of what behavior, if it's not a full out seduction story, what kind of behavior or love bombing tends to rope you in, and what kind of person are you tending to fall for? Because that's very eye opening. And he says, recovery requires staying in reality and not getting sucked in by the seduction story and hoping that something problematic isn't indeed a problem. And so then the fourth point is in understanding the abuse triangle. This was very powerful for me too. It says the abuse triangle is involves the victim, the victimizer, and then the rescuer. So the victim believes the abuser's story of why they are being abused. The abuser identifies with the target and knows exactly what they need to hear. The rescuer wants to protect the victim since the rescuer has a history of abuse as well. The victim obsesses about the abuser obsesses about the victim, and the rescuer obsesses about the crisis. They are all naive in their own way. The victim believes promises of change. The abuser believes that they will get away with it, and the rescuer believes that the rescue will really work. All three positions represent boundary failure. Victims fail to protect themselves, abusers fail to regulate their behavior, and rescuers fail to define themselves and become enmeshed with others when they are caught up in a crisis, losing their sense of self. This is the impossible dynamic. In order for their needs to get met, the victim allies with the abuser in order to get their needs met. So we're twisting ourselves into an emotional pretzel and holding on to hope and buying into all of their excuses and lies. So we're looking to them in order for us to get our needs met. But the abuser deceives and violates the victim in order to meet their needs.
And those roles in that triangle
Mm-hmm.
can shift around or look like they're shifting around, and that's
Yes.
something. This is why, in my opinion, a lot of us end up going, are we the narcissist, are we abusive, because that reactionary abuse is fits into this triangle. We find ourselves feeling like we're in the abuser role, feeling like we're in the rescuer role, and feeling like we're in the victim role at different times, and they overlap, and it's extremely crazy making.
Yes. And I think it's important to realize that any one of these three roles is a problem. So
Yeah.
any one of these three roles is a sign that you're in a toxic relationship. And that it's a truly is a boundary violation. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about last night of trying to help. So many of us have this kind of natural bend in our personality of being a helper and feeling, okay, how do we help in a way that's actually helpful? And the difference is between getting out of that rescue mode and getting into like empowerment mode, because at the end of the day, it's the person in that relationship. Because so many of us, when we get out of these things, we want to rush in and help others. And I'm for sure guilty of this.
Me too.
And, and we see it like when we want kind of this frantic desperation for them to see it too, so they can be set free. Like we're kind of like, running alongside the monkey that's holding onto the fruit as he's being carried away. And we're like, let go, just let go. You've got to let go. Like, please listen to me. Your life depends on this. You've got to let go. And that monkey's just not ready to let go yet. And it's so hard to just realize I, I,
Well,
they
and
have
none of
power
us
in your
wants to
life.
see someone else suffer. But
Exactly.
until I got to the place where I started to feel genuinely empowered, and I could see a lot of beauty in this whole transformation and the post traumatic growth, it's a fantastic thing. I mean, I know that sounds really ridiculous at another point in the process, but now that I see that, I look back on times when I tried to get my goodness all over people and help being not at all what I thought. I mean, my intentions were good, but I didn't get the fact that I was getting in the way of their intrinsic right to have that empowering journey. And that
Yes.
is, and it is an empowering, positive, uplifting journey when you get to that place. It's going to suck first. I'm not going to even
Yeah.
try and cover that part up. It does. But once you get past the suck, it's really, really good. And I will now never jump in to get my goodness all over somebody without stopping and thinking about, what is really the compassionate, kind, loving thing to do that's not going to deny them of that right. I mean, it's really changed how I look at what help is and when to use it.
Completely. Yeah. Narc Free says, my counselor said that the rescuer is the most maligned in the end. They're the ones, they can very quickly become the bad guy, because now you're getting between the victim and the victimizer. And so the abuser hates the rescuer, and then that the target of the abuse kind of slips in and out between feeling really resentful and like, oh, you just need to go away, you don't understand us, this is just how we fight, you just don't want me to be happy, you're just you hate men, or like you hate women, or what, or whatever. Like, it's like
That's the place where that self isolation starts to happen that we were talking about in the
yes,
start.
but then it can very quickly become a very dangerous situation for the rescuer too, emotionally or physically, because you've got the abuser who doesn't want you to be in the middle of it. And then you've got the target who sometimes wants you to be in the middle of it, but sometimes doesn't. And then if they're so manipulated, it doesn't take a lot for them to start turning against the rescuer. And then next thing you know, like, you're potentially really in danger because you've got two people that are,
Especially if the abuser is cunning enough to spot this and use that as an opportunity to bond with the victim and ally them. You can have my love and we'll be allied in this together, us against the world, and there's the world, and now both those guns are pointing at you. And unfortunately, I can look at times where there was some of that. I've experienced that from. I can relate to all of the points of this triangle in different subtle ways that it's hard to really explain in words.
yeah, I agree. And Missouri Cowboy says, I totally disagree with Carnes on his expression of the cycle of abuse. The abuser and the target are not interchangeable in every case. I agree. They're not
Yeah.
interchangeable in every case. I
No.
mean, sometimes, but for when it is interchangeable, what happens, like Shay was saying, it's that reactive abuse. And
Yeah.
so the target gets pushed enough, or they begin doing silent treatment, they begin becoming verbally or even physically abusive, they start shoving back, they start hitting, they start cheating, they start lying and
I can
manipulating.
see how it could look like that to somebody who hasn't been in it, but it's not, I agree with what he said, that it's not the same thing as truly interchanging
I
roles, because
agree
it still
completely.
is the victim, sort of taking a little dodge over onto that corner of the triangle. That's not where they actually are.
Yes, they might be abusive, but it's a
You
way
hit
for
a dog with a stick enough times, it's going to growl and bite you. I mean, let's be honest here. It's
right.
it's not the same thing as setting out to be abusive in order to get
Right.
what you want.
Yes, thank you. I was trying to figure out a way to phrase that, because I'm like, abuse is about power and control.
Yes.
For the abuser, it's about power and control really over their target, and kind of making sure that they mold to their wants and needs. For the target, it's more when they do become reactively abusive, they feel oftentimes painted into a corner that they don't realize that they can or should leave this relationship. So they feel like, I've got no other option other than to fight back. And that they wouldn't behave like this had they not been pushed and painted into a corner.
Well, the other thing too is with the PTSD issues, when you've got a manipulator constantly pushing those buttons to trigger you and send you into that place, your cognitive brain is then hijacked, and in that moment you are all reaction, and that's a whole separate thing that could take hours just to go down that track. But the things that you say and do while you're highly triggered in the middle of what they call the flashback that's not who you typically normally are, and it's not the same thing as coming from the abuse corner of that triangle where you're specifically triggering that in someone else. It's a very, very different thing. And I
Yes.
think that's something that this book was really missing an understanding of.
Mm-hmm.
I would definitely agree with that.
And to me, it just goes back to, unless you've lived it, you just don't, there's things about it you just don't understand. I can
Yeah.
see how, from an outside perspective, like Missouri Cowboy was saying, like you're saying, where it does seem kind of these very set roles, but it's not. There's a lot of other stuff at work. And here, okay, this is one of my favorite parts of the book is this point number 5, understanding the difference between intensity and intimacy. And he says intensity is based around drama, betrayal, and passionate reconciliations. This is not intimacy. Intimacy is based on mutuality and respect. Intimacy has no secrets. Intensity requires secrets and develops from it. Conflicts that arrive in intimacy result in negotiation and a clear understanding about fair fighting. There is no fear and anxiety like there is with intensity. Consistency and vulnerability create an enduring relationship, not an episodic one. And an intimate relationship is an enduring relationship. An intense relationship is an episodic relationship, which you have good times are really good, bad times are really bad. Like that's an intense relationship. It's not one that's based on mutuality, love, trust, respect, anything that it needs to be. And he also has this chart. I don't know if he came up with it or if it's from somewhere else, but I really, really liked it. And
Yeah.
he describes the difference between intensity and intimacy. He says, in intensity, the dynamic between two people are the roles of victim and victimizer. In an intimate relationship, the roles are mutual and respectful. In an intense relationship, the feelings are of fear and arousal. In an intimate relationship, the roles are passion and vulnerability. In an intense relationship, the commitment is someone's in, it's generally one in, one out. In an intimate relationship, it's involved and enduring. In an intense relationship, the prospects are of threats of betrayal or abandonment. In an intimate relationship, there is safety and patience. In an intense relationship, the anxiety tends to be high drama. And in an intimate relationship, anxiety results in problem resolution. In an intense relationship, problems have no rules and there's no structure. And in an intimate relationship, problems are discussed and agreed upon, and they have a fair fight contract. So, like a fair fight contract would be kind of this understanding of it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to be cruel. It's, we're not bringing up stuff like really deeply hurtful stuff from the past, designed to kind of completely knock out the opponent. Like you're keeping on track, you're addressing the issue at hand. You're not fighting to win, you're fighting to resolve the issue. In an intense relationship, the development comes from a high level of distraction because it's always good times, then bad times. In an intimate relationship, the development comes from high periods of growth. In an intense relationship, the level of openness is not available. It's actually built on secrecy. In an intimate relationship, there are no secrets. And in an intense relationship, conflict has to do with escalation because you've got people that are trying, especially the abuser, fighting to win. So things keep getting more and more escalated, especially when you're, it's like talking to a brick wall or arguing with a brick wall. There's lies, there's manipulation, there's deceit, there's all of these things like you can't get through to them. In an intimate relationship, there's negotiation. In an intense relationship, it plays out where episode begets episode. And in an intimate relationship, there's consistency and there's endurance. And he says all fear intensifies human attachment. Control makes for fear and fear makes for attachment. So I thought that was a really good explanation of the difference between that intensity and in intimacy. And also kind of as a side note, here was a realization I had when reading the book. If fear intensifies human attachment. Then this might seem a little bit off topic, but it's not. If trauma bonds people, like there have been studies done that show if people go on a date and they go see like a horror movie, that they will leave that scenario cognitively. The way that they process it is it's this feeling of, we survived that, even though it's a movie, like, nothing happened to us, right? It was a movie on a screen, but it's that feeling of relief in all of the highs and lows. Like they almost got away. Some of them didn't get away. They got away. They didn't get away. Those kinds of things. And there's that relief when that movie's over of, we survived this. And it actually bonds two people closer at the end of a horror movie. It got me thinking about parents that are dealing with children who are going through kind of parental alienation, and thinking about how can we make kind of trauma bonds work for us. Because when the child is being alienated, oftentimes the struggle with the targeted parent is that the abusive parent, all of these trauma bonds are happening. They promise one thing and then they don't deliver. They there's threats to leave. There's threats to disown the child. There's threats to never see them again. These kinds of things. It's really hard for the other parent to kind of compete or to undo the damage that's being done. So my thought was, if the non-abusive parent could kind of create these situations with the child that are kind of, this feeling of fearful, but like surviving it, where it creates this, we got through this together kind of dynamic, that could actually really work to prevent parental alienation. So like doing an obstacle course together. I mean, obviously doing things that are, not traumatizing to your child and that are age appropriate, but like, possibly going to see, going through a haunted house or a haunted corn maze or a scary movie, or, like an obstacle course, if you're not into any of that. Things where, or one of those safe room things that they have now, where you have to figure this out in order to win. These kinds of things really do bond people. So it's a way that we can take kind of this concept of kind of quote unquote surviving something traumatic and using it in a positive way to build connection with other people. So that was just kind of my thought on that. I hope that doesn't sound messed up. Okay, let's see. There's two more points here that I wanted to touch on. Oh, Missouri Cowboy, thank you. Gave a live stream donation. He says, truth is allowed. Expressing truth and expecting accountability for the abusive actions of others is not being abusive. I agree. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's all about, it's reasonable to expect that you would have sincere and true intimacy with a person that you're sharing your life with. Like, that's not asking too much. That's a great point. Missouri Cowboy says again, to make his sheep trauma bonded, he simply introduced a dog they do not know. Then they will pack together in a tight flock. There's a lot of truth to this. Like, trauma really bonds people. If you look at what happened with the earthquake in Mexico, or I should say earthquakes in Mexico, or the hurricanes here, my dad and my brother live in Houston, and my dad was saying, he's like, I've heard that the times I've seen my father cry, I can really only think of maybe 3 times in my whole life. And this was one of them. And he was saying it was just so heartwarming how total strangers were bonding together and helping out people that they would have never talked to on the street otherwise. But everybody just snapped into survival mode, and it really became kind of them against the hurricane. And trauma, it really does. It bonds people together. And we can do that in in healthy ways instead of traumatic
Yeah, it
ways.
would be interesting to see some of the positive aspects of this explored in the world.
Yeah. I mean, for me, this is one of the coolest things about doing what I do is I get emails all the time from people from all different walks of life. I've gotten emails from rabbis. I've gotten emails from, from therapists, from judges, from people, in all over the world, from, in Africa or Egypt or, kind of, I don't Atlanta, like just all over, and all different walks of life, all ages, all genders, all sexual orientations, all religions, all everything. And this experience, this trauma of narcissistic abuse just bonds people together in such an inspiring and heartwarming way that kind of, like anything else that's potentially life threatening. I mean, it's so cool to see people come together and get past all of their individual differences and support each other. It, I love it. Like, I just love that. It's the coolest thing. Okay. So point number 6 is compulsive relationship patterns. And that people that have been traumatized tend to find themselves in a series of compulsive relationship patterns. There's 10 of them. And the first one is compulsive helplessness, AKA learned helplessness. This is where the child never grows up or is able to take care of themselves. And so for people that have been traumatized or abused, a lot, and there's a lot of very valid reasons for this, is because they've been, like we were talking about earlier, they were so ground down. They lack self-esteem. They lack self-worth. They lack self-confidence. And, if you've been told that every single thing that you do is wrong your whole life, you're going to think that you're an incompetent, incapable person when in fact you're not. So,
And this can happen to adults.
yes. Oh, completely. And so, yes, feeling like we're not able to stand on our own 2 feet. And then I think too, realizing that if, if a person, if they got married when they were 18 and they've never lived on their own, they've never paid bills, they've never managed their own money, they've never learned how to check the oil on their car or the air in their tires, or they don't know kind of certain things, they're going to be incredibly overwhelmed by that. And and I could see how that would make a person feel scared and very incompetent. Like, I don't know how to be an adult. Like, I don't know how to do my own laundry or to cook or do any of these things. But like with any new skills, there's a learning curve to it. So you might not know this stuff now, but that doesn't mean that you're incapable of ever figuring it out. You'll learn just like the rest of us. Nobody starts at the finish line knowing all of this stuff. And a lot of times we figure this stuff out the hard way. So just kind of realize that, like, you're not alone in feeling like there's major pieces missing and being overwhelmed by that. Okay, so the second compulsive relationship pattern is the compulsive focus on the abuser. This is especially true if a child is in an abusive home, they become the expert on the abuser. The child loses their sense of self and becomes completely focused on appeasing the abuser. And of course, this holds true with adults too. Compulsive self-reliance. The child becomes excessively self-reliant. No needs are expressed and no help is asked for or accepted. All affection and closeness are avoided. They consider themselves self-sufficient as an adult. And as a child, these children tend to be seen as very mature for their age. But a child who's acting like a little adult, that's a really big sign that there's either abuse or neglect going on in that home, because it's not normal for a 10-year-old to act like they're 30 or to act like they're 20 and to be responsible for cooking meals and doing laundry and babysitting their younger siblings and these kinds of things. Compulsive caregiving, where the priority is placed on the needs of others with feelings of martyrdom and resentment resulting. Self-sacrifice goes to the extreme. Care is supplied whether requested or not. Yeah, I totally relate to that. Compulsive care seeking. Problems are presented so that care will be received. Relationships are defined by those who can supply assistance. The victim expects others to be responsible for major areas of their life. The only reason anyone gets close to the victim is to provide help. The latest problem is a reason to have a relationship or a friendship. And this was a pattern that I noticed, like we were talking about earlier, where in last night too, where a lot of us, for sure myself included, made our relationship our number one priority, then would put friends and everything else like at the end of the line until we needed them. And then we were in crisis mode. And if we had, like, so for me, I had a few friends that we all had the same pattern. So we all put our relationships first, put ourselves way last until one of us was in crisis. And then it would kind of trigger this kind of compulsive care giving in other people where we would then hop to their rescue. But it really wasn't a friendship. We were bonding out of crisis.
Yes.
And so then if we actually needed something like, hey, let's just go hang out and have a drink. Nobody was around because, well, why would we do that? Nobody's in crisis. And that was such an aha moment. And then talking to my other friends about that, one in particular, I think it really kind of woke her up too. And our dynamic is very different now. And we just didn't realize that was where we'd been going wrong. And because that had been our dynamic with like healthier people who, when we kept finding ourselves in these dysfunctional relationships, those healthy people ended up leaving. They weren't in our life. And then we were so hurt. We're like, well, I guess they're not really our friends. And, and then we would go kind of, call up the people that would respond to our crises. And, not realizing, to the healthy people, they were like, you guys just need a friend, but you don't know how to be a friend. And they were looking, like Marie was saying the other night, looking for that equal sense of giving and that mutuality with friendship. That was very profound. So like, if you take away the crisis, what commonality is there and what are we doing to nurture those friendships?
And we tend to think of the overgiving from the earlier piece as we're being a good friend, but that's really not what the good friend is. And that was huge for me to understand too, because I totally did not get that until a lot more recently.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. And let's see here. Compulsive rejection is another pattern that we tend to repeat. So rejecting others before they can reject us. I think that kind of goes back to, we're so used to disappointment that to keep ourselves guarded, we either find ourselves in relationships that we feel are very safe, or so we're not emotionally invested, or we start finding things that are healthy and then we freak out and reject them. Or I will say too, this does play out in one other way that I don't think is understood to the point that it really needs to be, especially with like kind of outside people, is what happens is a person will then not learning, hold on, I gotta sneeze. Excuse me.
Bless you.
Not realizing all the lessons that they need to squeeze out of this, then the target will hop back into dating and they'll find themselves falling for that same type of seduction story, that love bombing, that whirlwind, that intensity. And then they're like, oh man, what's wrong with me? I have all of these internal alarms going off, but this guy is so different from the last guy on some levels, but obviously it's the same problematic personality at the core that's registering at a deeper level with us, but we're trying to convince ourselves that this is not a problem. And so we're like, no, I must have issues with men or commitment or what have you. And so we're forcing ourselves to continue this relationship and to trust somebody that's showing us that they can't be trustworthy, because we just don't have a good sense of kind of what's appropriate behavior and what's inappropriate behavior.
It ends up
And
being like the same house with different siding and paint, and we don't realize
exactly.
it.
It's the same guy, different name is what it is, over and over and over and over again. And then we start feeling cursed. Why am I so unlucky? Why do I keep attracting these men or these women? What is it about me? Why I must not be worthy of love? But the reality is, like, there's pieces of information that we're missing and things that we're not connecting in the right way. And I've talked about this before, but it's really common for a person to start linking the wrong things up. They're like, well, okay, that's it. I'll never date a redhead again, or I'll never date, an Italian man again, or I'll never date a younger woman again, or I'll never date a bartender again, or I'll never date a Scorpio again. But it's not any of those things. It's the problematic behavior that's the problem. So it's so important that we learn the right things from what happened. Okay, so so number 8 is compulsive identification with others. This is a big one. This is what we all tend to fall into, is having instant sympathy for others and easily believe the most outrageous lies and fall for the wide variety of seduction strategies, but in the presence of the abuser, get carried away with the seduction story. Their gullibility produces personal loss and constant chaos. And so this is, a lot of people will say, like, okay, I'm really empathic, and this has been my downfall, is I continue to sympathize with this abusive person. I keep falling for this. And this is exactly what they're talking about here. And this is a boundary violation. It's that blurred boundary where we're projecting our morals, our values, our goodness, our feelings onto them. We're over empathizing with them, and it's all a ploy. It's all a manipulation ploy, and we're falling for it hook, line, and sinker, in large part because we really feel like we need to. This is the relationship we're highly invested in it working out, so we want to believe the manipulation, and that's what keeps us roped in. And again, a lot of it too is just not realizing that people lie to the extent that these people lie. Number 9, compulsive reality distortion. This is a huge one. The victim persists in not seeing abuse as abuse. Excuses, rationalization, minimization, and other defenses combine to allow the endurance of more pain and exploitation. In part, this comes from wanting to believe the fantasy of the story and ignoring the obvious. And I would also say a lot of it too comes from what our baseline is for normal. So if a person grew up, being with a parent that was an extreme alcoholic, or being beaten or molested, or these kind of extreme circumstances, and to them that they're like, that's a problem. Or let's even say that it was their next door neighbor that was married to an alcoholic or an addict or being beaten. In their mind, they're like, okay, that's a problem. So what I'm experiencing now isn't like that thing that I identified as a problem. So I guess what I experienced isn't that much of a problem. Maybe I'm just too sensitive. And so they're continuing to just kind of justify and allow and smooth over, when the reality is, abuse of any kind, if a relationship is not nourishing and empowering, then why are we there? So that's a big one. Okay, number 10 is compulsive abuse seeking. The victim sets up patterns of abuse in future relationships. I see this, the not so much like extreme abuse, but what I do see is a lot of targets miss that level of intensity. And so because things are feeling flat in their current relationship, and the only way that they have ever really felt loved was with love bombing, then I've seen people, they start to kind of self-sabotage or to provoke, like planting seeds of jealousy within their partner to get a reaction, or flirting with somebody else, or maybe trying to pick a fight. They're trying to evoke this passion, this intensity, because to them, that's what real chemistry is, but it's not. It's trauma bonding.
I think too, people unconsciously miss the intermittent reinforcement, especially when it's in that catharsis phase where you go from the mean part of the cycle back into the sweet part of the cycle, and you feel that moment of hope and, oh, things are finally going to change. And it's such an intense relief in that moment that you miss that without realizing what it is you're really missing.
Yes, absolutely. And gamer Christina wrote a great quote in here. She says, every time you don't follow your inner guidance, you feel a loss of energy, a loss of power, and a sense of spiritual deadness. And that comes from Shakati Gaiwan. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but I love that. It's so true. It's that
That's
inner
awesome.
guidance is there to guide you. And if we're not letting that happen, then we start kind of like the other quote goes, kind of living this life of quiet desperation. And okay, so the last point, my last big takeaway from this book, which I love so much, to me this was such a game changer with the way he explained this, is with understanding boundaries. He says with healthy boundaries, the zipper opens from the inside. So thinking of it as like a jacket you zip up. A healthy, like a nourished, healthy, grounded person, their boundaries they're going to be in charge of that zipper. So they say when it goes up and when it goes down. If somebody asks for information from a person with healthy boundaries and they don't want to give it, or they don't want to do something they don't want to do, they don't just unzip, they say no. If they are told that they are bad or responsible for something they are not, they figure those comments are really about the other person, not them. So they don't let that stuff in. People who have been tyrannized by terror have zippers on the outside. Anyone can access them. They simply unzip. They reveal information they don't want to. They commit to things they don't want to, and they feel responsible when they've done nothing wrong. The challenge is for the person to get the zipper in the right place. This requires more than knowing when somebody is being abusive. It means being able to say no, and to say no without shame, which takes practice.
It also takes knowing your preferences. Boundaries really are preferences. So when you go back to that whole piece about learning what you really do like and not like, that's so huge. Because without that, you can't do boundaries.
And understanding how you feel along the way. I mean, I think that can be a really useful guide of paying attention. If somebody asks you a really wildly inappropriate question, well, when was the last time you've had sex? To a person that has that zipper on the outside, they might just find themselves, and I struggle with this too, just instantly being like, I'm an open book. I'll just tell you whatever you want to know, regardless of whether or not that's actually the appropriate thing. And then kind of after the fact, we feel uncomfortable. We feel very like we've overshared. We might feel shame. We might feel used. We might feel icky. We might feel resentful, angry, violated. Those are all signs that our boundaries have been crossed. And so and we want to think to ourselves like, okay, well, that's the other person has the problem. They shouldn't have been asking questions like that. That's wildly inappropriate. They're the one that needs to change. But the reality is we don't have control over that other person. There's people like this in the world that are going to push your boundaries. All we have control over is where that zipper is, and if we keep it up or if we let it down.
Yeah, and dealing with the PTSD issues, if that's something that if you I've had trouble with a lot of freeze responses in situations like that, where I just go into this sort of mini shutdown, like where I don't know what to do when someone presents me with some really inappropriate question, like you gave that example. That used to be a real problem for me, is my reaction. I needed a lot more reaction time to get through that piece, and dealing with the CTPSD stuff has really helped me lessen that being an obstacle to setting the boundaries, if that makes sense.
Yep, totally. And Maria here says, the more you become in alignment, you will attract and maintain all people who match your level of alignment. That is why there is no getting around working on ourselves. Completely. There's, like we were talking about last night, our external environment is a reflection of our internal environment. So when we see other people, and that can be really empowering and it can be really depressing all kind of at the same time. If we're not getting the results that we want in our life, the nourishing friendships, the happy relationship, the, whatever, the house, the car, the job, the whatever, there's something, within us. And this is not to say that this is your fault by any stretch, but this is the self-love piece, and examining, where are my standards, and where am I settling for crumbs, and what do I think I'm worth, and what do I think is possible? And you'll know when you're on the right path when your external environment starts to really change in a positive direction. It's powerful stuff. So if you ever need to kind of feel the need to be like, am I making progress? Like, how are things going for my internal environment? Am I really doing the work? Look around. Very, very telling. It's also very telling because with other people. So I have found it's obviously the same with them, right? So like their external environment's a reflection of their internal environment. If they're hanging out with people that have no moral compass, you know, people that are lying and stealing and cheating and manipulating and doing all kinds of stuff, that's a reflection of their internal environment and kind of where their baseline is for what's acceptable behavior. So if you really want to know kind of where a person's morals are, look at their friends. That'll really tell you what they're okay with in their life. It's very powerful stuff because that's not a coincidence. People with a solid moral compass really enjoy hanging out with people with a solid moral compass. They don't have time to be dealing with nonsense. And this is another thing too with dating, why it's so important for us to get to that place where we're able to bring our highest and best self to the table. If we're struggling with alcoholism, odds are we're either going to attract another alcoholic or we're going to attract an enabler. It's not going to be a healthy relationship until we get that stuff within us fixed, whatever that stuff might be. So that was really powerful. And he says, okay, he goes on, setting boundaries helps to clarify values. By successfully implementing boundaries, a new trust for yourself emerges. You do not have to have the zipper on the outside. For example, if a person has been sexually abused, their boundary may be to become celibate. Learning that you can set a boundary, a new trust emerges. With healthy boundaries, no one can exploit you. By trusting yourself, you can give yourself over to passion. Learning to trust yourself is perhaps the biggest piece and the most important part of recovery. If somebody violates your boundaries, you leave. Saying goodbye can be heart-wrenching for survivors as they've already experienced so many losses. But it's here where they have to confront their deep desire for the seduction story to be true. If you want things to be different, you will have to give up the compulsive rescuing. Oh, wait, stand by. Yes, this is correct. You have to give up the compulsive rescuing, aka the pathological giving. We have to identify some behaviors we refuse to do anymore. What's the difference between healthy nurturing and coming to the rescue? It's the difference between empowering and helping. It's not empowering somebody to do something they can do for themselves, and it's insane to help somebody exploit you. So I really like the part with the boundaries and realizing, I think his example there was kind of a strange one, but the point being, you're in control. So even if other people want you to start dating, if you're not comfortable dating, you control the zipper. They don't get to decide when you start dating. They don't get to decide when you become sexually active. They don't get to decide how much time you spend talking and texting to people. You set the pace. You decide the speed of that zipper and who you're going to unzip around. And not every question, you don't need to be an open book. And it's okay to say no, and it's okay to have those boundaries. I think you'll find, if you're anything like me, that this stuff, it takes practice. Like I have found within myself, I have a lot of kind of knee-jerk reaction to things. Like my knee-jerk reaction is to jump in and rescue. My knee-jerk reaction is to answer honestly and without a boundary, when there needs to be a boundary. And that's still something that I am working on.
Me
So
too.
yeah, so I think you'll find that even though you might be aware of it, this is the whole thing. Like, change takes effort, and it takes consistent effort and work, and continually reevaluating, what did I do right? What needs work? And adjusting accordingly along the way.
Now, boundaries do take a lot of practice.
Yes, they really do. And for me, it was so, other people really set the pace of things, and I would just get more and more uncomfortable because I didn't feel comfortable saying no, and I didn't want to be rude. And you know, in setting a boundary isn't rude. Like,
No.
other people are used to other people setting boundaries. Like, I don't know why we feel like, oh no, we're going to be the only one that's not going to let them get their way. Like, no, their boss sets boundaries, other people set boundaries, but boundary pushers just zigzag around people that set boundaries, and they seek out those of us that are quick to unzip and have no boundaries. So, okay, so my last 3 points that I wanted to cover in this book were 3 different words that I really liked that he mentioned that I thought were worth passing on. So the first one is the term book ending. And this is like, you have your uh, bookends on a bookshelf. So you have your books in the middle, bookends on either side that hold them together. Bookending is where the target is given support before and after having contact with a traumatizing person. This is especially useful if the target cannot go no contact for whatever reason. I really like that concept. So, for example, if you're going to be going to court and you're going to be, seeing this traumatic person, bookend yourself. Get support ahead of time, and then make sure you've got support afterwards. So maybe you go out for coffee, or maybe a non-caffeinated drink, something that's not going to trigger that anxiety within you, but you go out for tea with a friend beforehand, and then you go out for lunch with a friend after, or you meet with a therapist beforehand, and then you have a scheduled appointment to meet with a therapist afterwards. So you're bookending yourself, so you're giving yourself the support that you need for that situation. I love it. Love that concept. The concept of stillness. This is where you give yourself time, even if it's a few seconds or minutes, before taking action so you can respond instead of react.
That's huge for
It
me.
is so huge. And so, yeah, he says in the book, the example of this woman had divorced her husband, and he was very demanding, very much a bully, very insistent, and bullies, and they'll knock you off balance. So things will be fine. And then all of a sudden, they send you this kind of barrage of text messages that are hurtful and inappropriate, or they know that they're not supposed to contact you and they do contact you, or they show up at the door and you've got a restraining order against them. These kinds of power and control dynamics. And so the author was saying, give yourself some stillness. Don't be in reaction mode. If they show up at your door and you have a restraining order against them, you don't need to go answer the door. If you can go into the other room and call the police. Or if they text you and they're being really ugly to you, you don't need to respond to that. Or if they're demanding to know, our daughter has a school play on Friday. I need to know, like, right now, what time, and are you going to have dinner for her? They're wanting you to react immediately, for you to buy yourself some time, and you don't need to respond right away. So let's say you respond, you kind of breathe, you ground yourself, you come up with what response you're going to have. You text them back in 5 or 10 minutes,
This is a
or
good thing to practice with somebody. If you have a friend that would be willing to sit down, like with a list of questions, and just give you a safe space to practice pausing a few seconds before you reply, so that it becomes a little bit of a habit to be able to do that without second guessing yourself, that practice can make a big difference. Especially if you
yes,
feel pressured by people wanting something from you, which I think as overgivers, that's a big kind of vulnerability aspect of this, it's hard to give yourself the stillness if you feel pressured. So if you can practice not feeling pressured that way, and if you don't have somebody you feel comfortable doing this with, you could use the voice recorder on your phone and ask yourself questions and play them back and just practice taking a couple of seconds. Even if you start out going 1001, 1002, 1003, and then you answer, just to give yourself that habit of taking a couple of seconds before you jump to the answer, that can make a big difference.
Absolutely. And, kind of like you're saying, role playing this out. This was one of the things, and actually, real quick, Favero, the giggler, thank you for the live stream donation. One of the things I was thinking with the last election, not to get political, but I kept thinking, I'm like, man, and I wasn't a fan of either candidate, but I kept thinking, I'm like, the Clinton camp and the Bernie Sanders camp, they're training for this all wrong. Like, they're not practicing being knocked off balance, and they need to be. So this isn't about kind of knowing their political stance on things. It's about being knocked off balance, because that's what Donald Trump does really, really well. And so with any type of personality like that, to really practice this ahead of time so you're not so knocked off balance in person. And if you don't have anybody that you can practice with, you can practice with just an empty chair in a room, and you can start playing both roles. Most bullies are going to go after things that you're most sensitive about. So whether, I don't know, your weight, your height, your clothes, your, whatever, odds are they've already picked on you about it before. So anticipate that and try to plan for it. So when it does happen, you're not so knocked off balance, and you're practicing, like Shay is saying, you're practicing not being in reaction mode. You're turning that zipper inside. So now you're in control of it. They're not deciding, you text me back. They're not saying jump and you say how high. Like, you're giving yourself that room to where you can actually respond. And the last concept I really enjoyed was that of carried shame. He said targets feel shame, and targets carry the shame, and the abuser remains shameless. And that's so true. So we're so embarrassed and feel bad and feel guilty and feel shame and embarrassment and all of these things for how they're treating us and for why. And we're going through all of this massive effort, and we're relieving them of that appropriate guilt. Like, they should feel bad for how they're treating us. But instead of them carrying their own garbage, we're carrying it for them. So I thought that was really powerful.
That's actually really a crucial point, because it's sort of fundamental to the whole dynamic of this kind of relationship, because it's like a transference of their shame into us during the whole course of it all. So it's really pretty profound when you get into that one.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And it's getting these things in alignment. We've talked about before, there's a difference between appropriate guilt and inappropriate guilt. And appropriate guilt is when we've done something wrong and we feel bad about it. That's appropriate. That's our stuff to carry and our stuff to resolve. Inappropriate guilt is just that. It's that carried shame. It's feeling bad when we've done nothing wrong, especially if somebody else abuses us and then we feel bad about it. So getting that zipper, I tell you, man, it's all about getting that zipper on the right side. And it's an absolute game changer.
I love that analogy, the zipper.
I do too. To me, that just really clarified it, and I think that was another missing piece for me too, because I was very quick to open up. And for many, many years, I actually thought that as a very good sign. I liked that about myself. I'm like, I am an open book. You can ask me anything and I'll answer it. And, I have nothing, because I had nothing to hide. So I was just sort of like, well, whatever you want to know, but not realizing that level of trust and openness, it's something that obviously I'm very different on YouTube than I am in my personal life. Like the close people in my inner circle know all this stuff about me, but I don't have these conversations with, just anybody. So,
Yeah, it was interesting for me to realize that
yeah.
not oversharing that way isn't about me not feeling like I'm an open book. It's okay for people to know this. It's about an entirely other thing, and that's that it's
Yes,
really not safe to be that open in the world. And I really didn't understand that until a lot more recently in life either.
totally. Totally. We talked about a little bit about it last night. Like, man, I really love having these really deep dive conversations with people. To me, that's just, man, I just love that. I love figuring out, like, what do people fear, and what have they gone through, and how have they overcome it? And I really like those deep dives. And I didn't realize that that was inappropriate, and that I needed to kind of pace myself with stuff like that.
Yeah,
And
that's huge for me too.
yeah. So lots of aha moments. So if you guys are interested in the book club, you can go to my website while I'm thinking about it, thriveafterabuse.com. There's a link in the description below. It's thriveafterabuse.com/book hyphen club. And that'll give you the list of books we're reading, the notes. That I'm starting to do a new thing where I'm doing my top 7 takeaways from every single book that we read. And Lucy normally posts her notes on there and all of that. If you're interested in being a part of the book club, you can email me, Dear Dana at thriveafterabuse.com. And we can go from there. And then there's a few other links down below. So the next book that we're reading for October is called Necessary Endings. It is fantastic. I was talking about it last night on the live stream. I would say it's one of my top 5 favorite books that I've read. I got so much out of that book. And I will say the first 30 or so pages, it feels like a business book. And so much so that I thought that I had the wrong book. And I had to go check Amazon to make sure that I was actually reading the right book. But it's about necessary endings in every aspect of our life. And I actually found that to be very helpful because it gives a person that emotional distance in order to see a situation clearly. Because talking about a necessary ending with somebody being fired at work or us quitting a job, something that we're not so emotionally invested in, it's a lot easier to see a lot of these principles at work. It's a lot harder when it's, your husband or your wife that you've been married to for 45 years. So I liked that about the book, but just kind of a heads up. It might seem like you're reading the wrong book, but you're not. uh, let's see. I love it. Maria says, yes, as far as being an open book, I look at it like, people must earn my story. I agree completely. Yep. And Lauren asks, hi, everyone. Why do I always forget book club time? Better late than never. Yes. So book club, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the last Thursday of the month. And again, that's on my website under book club. It has the date and time and all of that. So I think with that said, Shay, is there anything else that you'd like to add in?
I think we hit it pretty well.
I think so too. I really appreciate you sharing stuff and um, just being here. I think it's so fantastic. Like we were talking about before, for other people to hear other people's experiences with this and to hear their journey with boundaries and healing and recovering. It's so helpful. It's just so helpful.
Yeah. I think
So
it's
thank
awesome. I
you.
always learn something from everybody. It's like you were saying, everybody having different aha pieces, and you put all that together and you have something you can recognize other than just a box of puzzle pieces that are random. So I think it's great listening to everybody who comes to the live streams and the book clubs. I really appreciate everybody. So thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you for being here. And For the rest of you guys, I hope to see you next week at the normal live stream on Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That runs for about 3 hours. And then we'll do the Necessary Endings book club last Thursday of October. And I will have my notes on Necessary Endings up here shortly. I just need to comb through them one more time and make sure that they're all good. But those are up. And and the last thing, I have a link to Audible. I just joined their program. So if you click on the link in the description, you can get, if you sign up with the code Thrive After Abuse, you can get a free Audible book for when you sign up for the subscription. So the link down to that is down below, audibletrial.com/thrive after abuse, to get that free book with a subscription if you're interested in that. So that's all we got tonight, guys. We'll see you next week. Thank you so much for everything. And as always, lots of love to you. You are not alone. You are not crazy, and you really can move forward and heal from this. So take care. Have a great week. See you later.